Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Deep Dive, Emerald City Hockey Seattle Kraken podcast. RJ, we are very close to, I don't know, is it your favorite day on the hockey calendar, on the NHL calendar?
It's close. You know, the trade deadline in past years has sometimes disappointed. So I think July 1st is probably my favorite just because there are trades, there's free agent signing, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. But I think trade deadline is easily my second favorite. You can probably tell on the video version. I look a little happier than usual.
Yes, definitely looking good. It doesn't. I don't think it comes close to the draft for me. Draft day is still probably my favorite on the schedule, but yes, it is definitely one of the more exciting times to be covering an NHL team and to be a fan of an NHL team is when the trade deadline comes around, and it is coming at the end of this week, RJ. So of course, today on the podcast, we're going to be talking a lot about the potential trade options the Kraken are going to have out there. Basically, who's going to be available.
Yeah, pretty much. I think the Kraken are pretty solidly positioned to be sellers at this year's deadline, but still a lot of exciting deals to happen. And at least from reading the room in my last Armchair GM stream on Patreon, it seems like most of you are excited about the prospect of some change.
Yes, definitely. We'll talk about Philip Grubauer being back as well here in just a little bit. But RJ, as the trade deadline approaches and numerous Kraken players' names are being floated around, as we just talked about, you know who we'd never trade, RJ?
I know somebody who is just completely on our untouchable
You
list.
know where I'm going here? That's, of course, the law offices of Rico Tessendor. With Rico's professionalism and care, he is somebody that anybody would want as part of their team, right? But thankfully, he's on our team here at ECH, RJ, and we are not accepting any calls. That said, Rico is taking calls. And if you're ever in an accident, whether on the road, at work, or anywhere in between, we hope that you call Rico at 425-778-9800 or visit his website, ricotessendor.com, to schedule a free consultation. He's won millions of dollars for his clients and helped thousands of people in the greater Seattle area. And as a fellow member of the ECH community, we know he'll help you too. So there we go.
That was fantastic, Dylan. And that's the beauty of it, right? Rico's on our team, but he can be on your team as well if you need him.
Definitely. Also, real quick, before we get to Philip Grubauer being back with the Kraken, RJ, want to talk about the Patreon schedule for this upcoming month of March. I'll kind of let you take it away. You're always the master of the Patreon schedule.
The master of the Patreon schedule. I like that. So we do have a Patreon schedule out for March and just in time because we do have our first event, the Armchair GM stream on March 7th. That is trade deadline day. I'm really excited about this one. This is probably my favorite Armchair GM stream of the year because we get to do it on trade deadline day, see exactly what the Kraken will have done earlier that day, and then go over those moves. That'll be March 7th, 7 p.m. And just remember trade deadline day. You can't miss it. But the very next day, we have our ECH live commentary, March 8th, for that Kraken at Flyers game. And that's a 9:30 a.m. start time. You excited for breakfast, Dylan? Are you going to bring some eggs, some bacon, maybe a little breakfast there?
I was legit thinking about doing maybe during one of the intermissions a brief cooking segment or something. Just take my laptop out into the kitchen, maybe whip up some like French toast or something. I don't know. Everybody, let me know if you want to see something like that.
I certainly do. So I'll cast the first vote. I would love to see that, Dylan. But everybody else, let Dylan know, because that doesn't matter what I think. I can watch Dylan cook French toast not whenever I want, but more often now if I plan it out now that he's living up here. And Dylan, I'll throw it to you for the final event of the month.
Yeah, that's of course going to be my next prospect chat. That's going to be March 24th at 7 p.m. And really looking forward to this one. What we're going to do is we're going to watch a Coachella Valley Firebirds game together. I'm gonna pre-record a game from earlier in the month, take out the commercials, take out the intermission breaks, and we're going to just watch the game together. And that way we can just kind of do a live read, a live scouting of all the players on the Firebirds and how everybody's doing as they're gearing up for their playoff run. So I'm really looking forward to that. I've kind of wanted to do something like that on the prospect chat for a while, and just feels like the right time to do it now.
Yeah, I think it's a great time, and it's kind of like live commentary, prospect chat all mixed into one. So it's going to be a really fun time. And then, of course, we have our Red Glare podcast every single week where we talk about topics from around the NHL. And of course, it'll be a busy one coming up because, we'll have to figure out what day this week's will be because Friday is the trade deadline and we're going to be swamped with Kraken stuff. I imagine it'll be slightly after that, but we can talk
Yeah.
about all the cool trades that happened around the entire NHL at the deadline.
Yeah. No, it should be good. Or we could do it on Thursday, RJ, and just spend an hour on the Seth Jones trade.
I'll leave it to you guys. Let us know in the comments which one of those you prefer. I can cast my vote early as well,
Yes.
and saying maybe I'd like to talk about some others. But the Seth Jones trade, it did happen.
That is fair. That is fair. All right, RJ. Philip Grubauer is back with the Seattle Kraken ahead of his bobblehead night tomorrow night. The Kraken, that was something that there was questions about for a while. We now have our answer. Philip Grubauer is back up. We got to talk with him a little bit earlier today at practice. I mean, there's a couple things to kind of talk about with this, with him being back, RJ. I guess I'm going to ask you the question that's probably the most wanted question out of all of this, and that is Gru here to stay, you think?
I think at least in the short to medium term, he is here to stay. And Dan Biles was asked about this if Grubauer was going to have the chance to get into a game sometime soon. Looking at the schedule, the Kraken do have a back-to-back coming up on the upcoming road trip, and Dan said that there will be a chance for him to get back into the net pretty soon. So I think we're certainly going to see at least one start from Philip Grubauer. But it does seem like he's here for a little bit. There is something interesting you pointed out to me earlier today, where in order to have eligibility for the Calder Cup playoffs, so the AHL playoffs, he would have to be on the Firebirds roster by the NHL trade deadline. So you might want to look out for potentially even a paper transaction there where they just nominally send him down before the deadline, call him right back up afterward. But that is going to be the indicator really of if he's going to be going down to Coachella Valley again or not.
Yeah. So it will be interesting to see if we see a move there. I believe he also needs to dress for some more games to be eligible for the playoffs down there with the Firebirds as well. So that would also be interesting. I wonder, do you think that's just left up to him to kind of make that call, or do you think the team would kind of force that?
No, I think they'd certainly consult with him on it. That's something that if he wasn't interested in, I don't think you'd make him do. It's all a discussion, I think, and a process between the team and the player. And just, I think everybody just wants what's best for Philip Grubauer, and they're going to do what they can to make that happen. And so I think that starts with this call up right now and getting him back to the NHL level, and something that it seemed like Grubauer himself, just watching practice, seemed very happy about. The smile on his face, you noticed, from up in where we were sitting many times, he's happy to be back with teammates. He's happy to be back around the team with the goalie coaches and everything, especially talking to his buddy Ellie Tolvanen. I noticed a few big smiles on his face when talking to Tolvi. So that was really nice to see.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm excited to see him up here potentially. It's going to be close, right? Because if he's going to play on over the weekend, then that kind of rules him out for the AHL postseason. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see where he ends up through all of that stuff. I'll ask you the next question around Philip Grubauer, RJ, and that is, what do you think the odds are he starts tomorrow night on his bobblehead night?
I don't know. I would say pretty low just because, and I asked this to you also at practice day, like, you don't think they start him, right? Just because, he has been playing in the AHL. It's going to be a little bit more of an adjustment. The opponent is really the biggest factor for me. The Minnesota Wild are actually a good hockey team. Mm-hmm. They're really good. And I feel like putting Grubauer in that position could be a little bit of maybe throwing him to the wolves a bit, just coming straight up. And I don't know what's entirely fair to him, but if you're going to call him up in the first place, and I have seen some people when we put out, talked about the news that he had been called up, some people weren't necessarily thrilled with it. I know there's a lot of people that, were not happy with Grubauer's play this season and all of that. I have no problem with the decision to call him up for this bobblehead night, because you're not in the playoff picture. This is something that you're doing. It feels like just a good business decision to me, right? This is something that you're doing for the fans, that you're doing for everybody to enjoy this fun moment. And it really would have been kind of awkward without him, at least there in the building. So I think it's really important to have him there for it. But you don't need to start him. I think it'd be totally fine. You let him back up and then just kind of work back into things before getting a start against maybe a team that's not as good as Minnesota.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you on that. It would be a lot to kind of throw him back in there off of what one practice, and then I think tomorrow's an optional morning skate. So it would be a lot to just be like, all right, you're back at the NHL level. Here you go. After kind of adjusting to the speed and everything of the AHL, it just kind of feels like a lot. But the community was going to want to know, have to ask the question for sure.
Yeah. And I still think it's possible. I don't,
Yeah,
it wouldn't shock me just because, hey, just let
what
him have it. And what's the
33%
worst that can
odds?
happen? Right.
Yeah,
You know,
33% odds.
oh, that's,
Because I think it's a little worse than 50-50, but it's
yes, it's
not
worse than 50
it's
50.
not
I'll,
nothing
yeah,
for sure.
I think about 1/3. That's what I'll give it.
Yeah. But yeah, it's going to be interesting kind of how they kind of play this whole thing with Philip Grubauer, but for now it's just nice having him back, having him around. So it's just nice to talk to him again, all of that kind of stuff. Definitely appreciate when Gruby's around for everything. And then yeah, on the Firebird side of things, I'd also talked about with you earlier that if you're the Firebirds, depending on what you want to do for that playoff run, it could make sense also just to want to stick with whatever rotation you think you're going to have for the playoffs. Just kind of use that the rest of this way. If that's going to be Stezka and Coco, just leave Philip Grubauer up, backing up Joey at the NHL level, and let those guys really get into a rhythm and everything with the team down in Coachella Valley before the playoffs start.
Yeah, I think that could be a fine way to approach it for CV. And just really, I think whoever you're going to have as your goalie tandem going to the playoffs, that's who you want for that stretch run leading up to it as well. You don't want a lot of turnover, a lot of change there. And then as far as, whether Grubauer stays or whether he goes back down or whatever, my one ask really of the Kraken during this time, the 22 games you have left, whoever your backup goalie is, be willing to play him,
Mm-hmm.
because we've kind of glossed over it or ignored it now just because we'd mentioned it so much in the past. But the Kraken really haven't stopped running Joey Decorda to the ground here. It'd be nice to get him a little rest post trade deadline. And so I just hope whoever is backing up in Seattle is someone they are willing to put in for an extra game or two just to give Joey Decorda some rest.
Yep, definitely. I'm with you there on that. Now though, RJ, I think it's time to transition over into the trade deadline. There you are, you're perking up. I will hand the podcast over to you. You can kind of drive the bus here the rest of the way. Where are we starting? Where are you starting with the trade deadline? There's a lot of places you could kick this off with.
Yes, plenty of places to start, but I think it's a good idea to start with just a little bit of an overview of how the trade deadline works for those who might not be as familiar. It might be your first trade deadline as a hockey fan. There are a few basics that I think are important to know before we dive into everything, and from the Kraken's perspective as well. So first of all, when is it? The trade deadline is in 4 days. It is Friday, March 7th at noon Pacific time. The Kraken at that time, I believe, will be on the road setting up their war room in Nashville, ready to go and make deals. But as for when trades usually start to happen, because that's a question we get a lot as well, usually trades will pick up about a couple days before the trade deadline. You'll start seeing some happen. I know we had the Seth Jones trade a couple days ago, so you'll start to see them trickling in, but there's always a flurry of deals on the day itself. One thing to note, though, noon Pacific time, that is the deadline to get trades filed with the league. So all the paperwork, everything has to be filed with the NHL by noon for a trade to count. But some trades will be reported after that, even up to an hour sometimes. We'll hear trades that start to trickle in. And I think it was the Victor Rask trade in year one that was almost an hour after the
Yeah.
trade deadline where that one popped up. So once you get to noon, just know there might still be trades in the pipeline that you haven't heard about. Hang tight. Some will happen after that. But sometimes you'll have GMs also come out and say, yeah, we're done for the day. And so you'll know, okay, no more trades from that team. Now, the trade deadline, one little wrinkle that I feel like a lot of people are familiar with is that it actually is not a hard deadline on making trades. You can make trades whenever. You can make them after the trade deadline. But the key element is that players traded afterwards are not eligible for the Stanley Cup playoffs. So that's the reason that teams want to get a lot of their business in, and the Kraken as well. They're going to be trading guys probably to teams that want them for a cup run. You need to get that deal in by the deadline in order for them to be eligible. So just something to know there. And then also a quick reminder that after the trade deadline, there is no roster size limit. So teams can have as many players as they want on the NHL roster, so long as it all fits under the salary cap. Now, one more thing, we will be talking about retained salary as well. We're going to mention that with a lot of the players, especially Yanni Gourde, Brandon Tanev. Teams are allowed to retain up to 50% of a player's salary. And of course, that translates over the cap hit as well that teams will be absorbing. Retained salary is a big part of trade deadline transactions because a lot of teams are close to the salary cap, and sometimes they can't afford to take on a full cap hit. So you'll see teams often retain 50%, usually on players with expiring contracts. And sometimes teams will even get a third party involved to reduce that cap hit further. You can have one team retain 50%, then another team, retain 50% of that. So get it 75% off. You can do that as well. So just know that for the Kraken, probably expect them to retain some money on, say, a Yanni Gourde, a Brandon Tanev, if and when those guys are moved. So that's all for my informational thing there. Any questions, Dylan?
No, I think it's perfect. Thank you for putting that together. I'm sure people appreciate it. I do, right? Like it's nice to have a helpful reminder about all those details because yeah, it always is one of those things. You always get some people that are like, why it's trade deadline passed? Why are things still getting announced and all of that? And yeah, it's because on the media side of things, we're pretty busy on deadline day. It can take a little while before that stuff gets out there.
Yes, definitely among the busiest days of the year, media wise, and especially for all the national people trying to wrangle all the trades. It can take a little while. So let's dive right into the Kraken side of things, though, from the trade deadline. And the way that I'm going to approach it, the Kraken are going to be sellers at the deadline this year. That's pretty obvious. So I'm not really going to look so much at players that they could acquire because they're going to be in the business of selling, not necessarily buying. So I'm going to kind of go by groups of players on the Kraken that could potentially move, and then look at the individual player, maybe what some of the best fits are for that guy, look at any potential factors with a trade, and then some potential deals or what a trade might look like involving that player. So I'm going to start with the two big pending unrestricted free agents for the Kraken, Yanni Gourde and Brandon Tanev. Those are the two guys I think most likely to move. They're the guys that everybody is talking about. All the insiders are talking about being on the market. So we'll start with Yanni Gourde. And the reason we'll start with him too is because there's an added element to it as well, where if you listen to some of the insiders, they'll say, of course, the Kraken are taking calls on Yanni Gourde, but Elliot Friedman reporting, though, that the Kraken are taking a shot at maybe trying to extend him and he might not be traded at all. So I guess we'll start with that, Dylan, before we get to any of the trade talk. What do you think of the idea of the Kraken actually extending Yanni Gourde and hanging on to him?
I mean, my first initial thought is just, wow, Ron Francis really does like collecting centermen, right? Like it's just a lot of centers in the organization. I got to think that if they are going to re-sign Yanni Gourde and keep him around past this year, that there would at some point be a shift to the wing for Yanni Gourde, just because look, anytime you're doing your armchair GM stream and you're kind of building out the roster, I kind of did that a little bit looking ahead at the prospects and as they're going to start coming into the NHL. One of the big things that you run into when doing any sort of exercise like that is the log jam up the middle, where you have Shane Wright, Matty Beniers, Chandler Stevenson, Berkeley Catton as somebody that the Kraken are very high on and could potentially play with this team next year, and somebody that they very much have been talking about as being a centerman for them. I think of those names and then I think, where is Yanni Gourde supposed to be, right? It's already bad enough that one of those people has to be your 4C, right? Half of them have to be in your bottom six. Where's Yanni Gourde supposed to fit in there? But we have seen Yanni Gourde, at times shift over to the wing. I got to think that any sort of re-signing of Yanni Gourde would involve transition over to the wing, where he can then maybe play with one of those younger centermen, help with face-offs, stuff like that. And I think in that capacity, I think Yanni Gourde could be very beneficial to the Kraken, right? We've seen the work that he's done with players like Matty Beniers or a Shane Wright when it comes to helping them with faceoffs at practices and things like that. We know what a fan favorite he is. Obviously, on that side of things, people would love to see Yanni Gourde to hang around. I'm sure it would be good for business for the Kraken to have Yanni Gourde hang around. But just the way that he kind of lights up the room when he walks into it, the way he interacts with everybody during practices or in the locker rooms that we've been able to see, I got to think that that would also potentially be a benefit for the Kraken.
Yeah, and I think, in the room, he's certainly somebody that everyone likes to have around. But in my opinion, re-signing Yanni Gourde makes zero sense to me at any kind of reasonable number that you'd probably end up having to pay him. And you mentioned the logjam at center. If he's playing center, he's your fourth line center, and I can't imagine that you'd sign him to a deal for any kind of money that would make sense for a fourth line center. And if he is moving to the wing, which I think would probably be the more likely option, that's just one more roster spot that you're maybe taking away from a younger player, or opening up for some change. We've talked about how much this core group needs to change if they're going to truly be competitive next season, and bringing somebody back, especially a 33-year-old, isn't really the type of decision I think the Kraken should be making at this time. Now, for some amount of money at 2 million or less, I'd certainly think about it. I think even 2.5, I might think, okay, that could be good value for a third line winger, right? Being paid less than, say, even an Ellie Tolvanen, and he can be productive in those spots. But I think he's going to cost more than that. And especially term, you have to look out for, right? I mean, if you're signing him to a 3-year deal, taking him to at least 36, 4-year deal, 37, you have to be especially wary on term. And so I think any kind of contract that Yanni Gourde would want as far as an extension just isn't something that's going to make sense for the Kraken. Now, what does make sense to me is the idea of maybe putting something like this out there, so that maybe if you're Ron Francis, it's something that strengthens your leverage a little bit going into the deadline, where if teams aren't really meeting your price, you could say, well, no, we're fine re-signing him, we don't need to move him, but maybe if you make it worth our while, we will move him. So that sort of thing makes sense, but I just do not see where the fit is for Yanni Gourde going forward.
Yeah, like I said, it's really as a bottom six winger to help out whatever center you have at 3C, whether it's a Berkeley Cat and stepping into the NHL next year or even the year after that, depending on what term it is. But realistically, from like a point production standpoint, you look at the 33 points in 80 games last year, kind of on a similar pace this year, slightly better, but not too much better. Has not broken the 50-point barrier with the Seattle Kraken. You are talking about, at that point, bottom six production realistically. And so, yeah, I think it would have to be a number that makes sense. And obviously the term would have to be something that makes sense for the Kraken to really do it. And yeah, I don't know that he would want to. And I got to imagine, depending on what him and his family want and are open to, I got to think that he could maybe find a situation and maybe even a better deal out there on the market. Just, for a team that might want somebody who can be more of a 3C defensive shutdown kind of guy that we know he can be come playoff times. I just got to think that other teams might be able to give him a little bit more than what the Kraken are going to be able to from a role perspective.
I would think so too. He's the type of player that competitive teams, there's a lot of demand for a guy like that. And so with that, we can transition over on the trading side of things, because I think there would be a lot of demand for him at the trade deadline. And I think in the more likely event that he gets traded, let's see what a trade might look like and what factors the Kraken will have to consider here. So Gourde does have a 9-team no trade clause, which is not that restrictive. It's only 9 teams on that list. You can work around that. And also you can still ask him for any team that is on that list, maybe, but still plenty of teams you can trade him to.
Yeah. And I would imagine that most of those teams would be kind of non-playoff teams that probably aren't interested in him anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's probably a lot of overlap there with teams that wouldn't be interested and teams that be on that list. So let's not focus on that too much. But as far as best fits for Yanni Gourde, there are a few teams. I kind of had 5 on my armchair GM stream that I thought came to mind as far as really good fits for Yanni. And that is the Toronto Maple Leafs, Winnipeg Jets, Vegas Golden Knights, New Jersey Devils, and Colorado Avalanche. I think all of those teams could add a center and could be looking to add centers there. And maybe some of those teams might ideally target, a top six type of guy, a 2C, but there are very few of those actually out on the trade market this year. And so I think he might be an option for some of those teams to circle back towards.
Oh, definitely. No, I think that again, really, we know where Yanni Gord plays best, right? Right, or at least where his best hockey has happened, and that was, of course, in Tampa Bay, in more of that third line center role, where come playoff time, he can either help a line push the pace of play, right? Try to play in the offensive zone for longer periods of time, kind of take advantage of those matchups that a third line is going to be able to get come playoff time, and really kind of help pressure and try to provide some depth scoring for a team. Or on the flip side, he can go out there against another team's top line or their second line and then really frustrate them and keep them off the board and really help kind of shut things down. I got to think that teams looking to bring in Yanni Gord would want him in that 3C role where he could, depending on whatever playoff series they're in, he could do one of those two things, or best case scenario, both at the same time, which he certainly did in Tampa on plenty of occasions. I got to think that that's more so what we're looking at would be the teams like, a Toronto, where they don't really need his help in the top six, but the bottom six could certainly use somebody like him with his experience that could go and do those things.
Yeah, and we even saw him do it with the Kraken a couple of years ago in the playoffs. I mean, he was fantastic, kind of
Yeah.
flipping those matchups in series like that. So, as far as the value on Yanni Gordon, by the way, I think whoever they're trading him to, they're probably retaining 50% of that contract.
Yes.
It just makes sense to do to help him fit under the cap. So, as far as value, I'm thinking maybe a little bit higher than a second round pick, that equivalent value to that. Now, the Kraken might be looking at prospects from other teams as
Hmm.
well. And so maybe you target a prospect in that equivalent range, but it does get a little difficult in trying to figure out specific prospects for teams that you could go target. So as far as value, I'm saying maybe a little over a second round pick. I made a few mock trades for my armchair GM stream. And like for one, I have Toronto, would be Florida's second round pick in this upcoming draft. And then a guy who I'd like to target, like a Dennis Hildeby, a young goalie who, not great numbers in the NHL right now, more of a project, but he's only 23, and maybe someone you could even start a few games and put in that spot down the stretch. With Winnipeg, I had their second round pick next year, and also maybe a guy like Alex Iafallo, someone who the Kraken could maybe flip for another asset as well, or hang on to him. And I think he'd be a good guy in the locker
Hmm.
room, and it kind of helps make it work a little bit cap wise. Iafallo hasn't really lived up to his contract, but it's up at the end of this year. Other teams, I just have basically second round picks and then occasionally somebody to maybe make the money work. But do you agree with my sense of value there as far as what we can expect?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think obviously, Ron's going to be asking for more. Ron's going to be asking for a first.
As you should.
I don't know that that's realistically necessarily going to be on the table for him. And also the way we've seen teams, especially the kind of perennial contending teams, operate, so they just don't always have firsts available. And I know I've talked about this before on things, but like if you go to like Tankathon and then you go down into the playoff range, none of the playoff teams this year have their own first round picks. So I just don't know that we're going to see a lot of deals involving first round picks, or at least first round picks from this year. We'll see if teams are open to moving, future first or something like that. But I think for Yanni Gord, given the role that he's realistically going to be playing on one of these competitive teams, I think you hit the nail on the head with that kind of second round pick or equivalent kind of prospect level value.
Yeah, so that's where I think he's at value wise, especially given Gustav Nyquist went a couple days ago for
Yeah,
a second round pick, and I think Yanni Gord, given the positional value, probably worth
agreed.
at least that. At the very least that. So I would be shocked to see him go for anything less value wise, but that's kind of where I'm at with Yanni Gord. So moving on to the next option, that's Brandon Tanev. And I think this one's a pretty straightforward type of deal. Maybe you look at prospects or something else, but I mean, as far as best fits, who wouldn't want a guy like Brandon Tanev in their bottom six? I think, with Yanni Gord, there are certain teams that are going to be looking for centers and others that maybe, are not as much. But I think just about every playoff bound team could use an energy winger in their bottom six. I think really the only constraint there is just the cap hit. and at
Mhm.
3.5. And the Kraken will probably, again, retain 50% of that, making him slightly less expensive, but still, it is a lot for a fourth liner if you are really tight to the cap and trying to add. As far as best fits, I had the Jets, the Capitals, Golden Knights, Leafs, and then Rangers. Although it seems like the Rangers now are might be selling off a little bit more. I don't know if they're going to load up for a run, but I think just about any playoff team would be a fit for him.
Yeah, because again, he can kind of change up what he's going to do based on the style of game that those teams are going to play. I certainly think that when he's at his best, it would be to play on a team that very much wants to focus on transition and getting up the ice quickly. You know, you mentioned Vegas, like he would be a very good Vegas Golden Knight in this Bruce Cassidy system. Like he would fit it to a T. I'm sure that's sending chills down the spines of many Seattle Kraken fans that would hate to see him wearing that sweater. But I think that that is, you know, the kind of team that he would most easily adapt to and could make the best use of his strengths and his skill set. But he's also the kind of guy that, you know, if a team is going to play more of a controlled style game come playoff time, they're not going to be focused as much on the transition because he has that physical element that he can bring, because he can be somebody that if you dump the puck into the offensive zone, he can be on a defense really quick and kind of force a bad decision there, or he can lay the body on them on that heavy forecheck. I think that he could also kind of fit in with teams that, you know, like I said, play a little bit more of a dump and chase controlled style zone aspect in come playoff time. And just the fact that he can do both of those things because he has the speed, because he has that physicality and can blend both of them so easily, I got to think that again, yeah, he just kind of fits anywhere, right? Similar to Yanni Gord. Like when you have that valuable of a skill set and a skill set that particularly kind of increases in value come playoff style hockey, anybody should want him. It'll be interesting to see who actually gets it. But I got to imagine if there's anybody that there is kind of more of a significant bidding war for, that Ron has to kind of manage and deal with, I got to think it's going to be for Turbo.
Yeah, and given that what I anticipate will be a robust market, I think the value on him is probably somewhere around a third round pick
Mhm.
or the equivalent. And I mean, do you agree with that roughly?
Yeah, I agree with that. And, you know, maybe if, like I said, you get enough people involved, maybe you can push that a little bit higher. But I think that that's equivalent again. Doesn't have the positional value of Yanni Gord. You are talking more of a fourth line role than maybe a third line role that Yanni could probably play on some of these teams. But yeah, I think that, you know, normally you'd be talking more so like a middle round pick for a fourth liner. But because of how versatile he is and how much interest there should be, I'm with you. I think a slightly higher than that is, or on the high range of mid round fits.
And he's got a reputation around the league too. I mean, guys know how Turbo plays, and I think
Yes.
that is something that's going to work in his benefit or in the benefit of a return there. Now, one more UFA I did want to mention just real quick. I don't think it'd be a complicated trade at all, but Josh Mahura, I
Mhm.
think it is worth bringing him up just because his contract is up at the end of the year. He's been a really good fit in Seattle and working his way into a roster spot and a regular spot, but he is someone that could be valuable for a contending team down the line. It's just kind of a sixth or seventh, well, probably a seventh defenseman realistically is some defense depth. If the Kraken get an offer of like a fifth round pick or something, maybe you have to think about it. I mean, if I'm Francis, maybe I insist on a fourth. And if nobody's willing to meet that, then I just hang on to Mahura. That's kind of how I would approach it. But maybe there is a team that's willing to do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, looking ahead at the blue line and things, the situation for next year, you could easily re-sign Josh Mahura and keep him around. You know, we've kind of talked about this in the past.
And I
A,
like that idea, by the way.
I do too. A lot of the top prospects for the Kraken on the blue line are not going to be ready for next year. It's really just going to be like Viljo Tavainen that's going to kind of be in that position to take that step forward and potentially become an NHLer next year. And you know, I think it never hurts to have camp competitions for like that role of sixth defenseman if everything else was to stay the same. And I think certainly having Josh Mahura around would be nice to have for that kind of stuff. And we've seen it this year, right? The physical element that he can bring, the way he fits into the system that this coaching staff wants to play defensively, it's all just worked. So there's kind of no reason if somebody wants to hit your price for it, you kind of might as well, just given the position the Kraken are in. But there's no need to say move him.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we've seen this exact kind of trade a couple of years ago, but the Kraken were on the other end of it when they brought in Jacob Megna as
Yep.
kind of a depth defenseman for a playoff run. I think this is that exact type of trade you might see. I believe a fourth round pick was the return for Megna. So it'd be that exact type of deal. So
And
yeah,
well,
go
and
ahead.
I was gonna say, and let's say he goes somewhere, competes in the Stanley Cup playoffs, helps a contender, all of that kind of stuff. You have Brandon Montour, and he always just ends up signing wherever Brandon Montour is, so he'll just come back in the offseason.
Yeah, exactly. It just works out.
Yeah,
So you could get the draft pick and have him sign. But I do think I do wonder if he'd be happy, kind of maybe either re-signing here or coming back here after a playoff run, just because he is buddies with Brandon Montour. I do think he has been happy with how his season's gone
yeah,
here, earning a spot. So those are kind of the pending UFAs to look at. But really, with the Kraken, I think it gets interesting when you move past those guys, because Gordon, Tanev, and to a lesser extent Mahura, we kind of know what that's going to be. But the Kraken have a number of players with a little bit more term on their deals that they could move, but are not under any pressure to move, but they could move them. And teams are calling about those guys. And so I want to start with some players that have 1 year left on their deal beyond this one. So the contracts are up at the end of next season. And I want to talk about Jamie Alexiak, Oliver Bjorkstrand, and Jaden Schwartz. So we'll start with Jamie Alexiak because I think he could be potentially the most valuable trade piece out of these three just because of positional value. Teams really covet defensemen at the trade deadline, especially big defensemen, especially big physical defensemen. While Alexiak isn't all that physical, when you're that big, I think teams tend to sometimes think that you're physical. So Alexiak has 1 year left on his deal beyond this one, $4.6 million cap hit, which is pretty reasonable, especially with the cap going up and everything. That contract was signed a while ago. And he does have a 16 team no trade clause. So that is half the league that he can't be traded to. Actually, a little bit more, since the Kraken are one of the teams. So 15 teams that would not be on that list. But I think the Kraken should absolutely be open to trading Jamie Alexiak. And if they can get good value, he's one of those guys I think they should definitely be willing to move. As far as best fits, I could see teams like maybe a Dallas, Tampa, or Edmonton looking to trade for him. Teams that are looking to make long playoff runs that could use some more help on the blue line. Dallas losing Miro Heiskanen, they're going to want to add a blue liner. Tampa, I think, still has some room to add there on the back end. And of course, Edmonton, it feels like they're always looking for a defenseman. So those teams might be calling and asking about him. And I think in a Jamie Alexiak trade, what you're going to want to target if you're Ron Francis are higher end prospects, because I think with the guy that you have a little bit more leverage on moving, you can go after some guys like in Dallas, maybe a Leon Bichelle. You might have to add something to Alexiak and retain some money. Tampa, maybe an Isaac Howard. I mean, the Oilers, home run type of thing would be Matthew Savoy. I don't think he would. You'd have to add to that, or maybe take on
yeah.
some bad money with the Oilers. But I think he could be part of trades like that could maybe net you a really good prospect who could step in the nearer term.
Yeah, no, and I love the way you're thinking around that with Jamie Alexiak, because I'm with you, right? Defenseman, especially somebody with his size, and credit to him, he tends to up the hit numbers come playoff time. Looking at his playoff track record here in front of me, 63 hits that year with the Kraken in the 14 games that they played. It's not bad. That's not bad at all. But I do think that is where, and especially with him having that extra year on the contract, him not being a rental for the rest of this year, that is where, if you're Ron Francis, you can kind of really get into some good stuff here as far as a return. And I'm with you. I think that a higher end prospect from one of these groups would make a lot of sense, especially because none of them have first round picks, which would be that kind of the other equivalent that you would kind of be looking for. So I'm definitely with you in terms of value. I think all three of those teams make a lot of sense, right? Dallas needed more defensive help even before the Heiskanen injury, and then now they really need it. Tampa, the blue line is clearly their weak point as far as them not being able to do what they want or expect to do come postseason time. And then the Oilers are the Oilers. It almost doesn't even feel like we need to talk about it. But looking at Jamie Alexiak also, I think it's one where, he's been great to have around and everything like that, but I just don't feel like he fits what this coaching staff is trying to do. he really feels the most like the odd defenseman out when it comes to the zone style defense that this group has been playing. He's just hasn't looked as effective as he has in years past under this current thing. I like the pairing of like him and a Brandon Montour at times, or the different looks that they've gotten. But I just think that this is kind of more a 2-3 zone heavy defensive system has just not really played to his strengths or his skill set that much, and it's made him look more expendable come trade deadline time than he would have otherwise. And so I think if there's any chance, if you're the Kraken, that the coaching staff's going to be around next year, I think that is something that you have to factor in, is that the way this coaching staff wants to play doesn't really match up with this player, and that makes the player somebody that you can look at taking advantage of come trade deadline time, other teams interested in.
And we said that about Will Borgen too before the
Yep.
Kraken ended up trading him, right? He's probably a better fit on some other teams and some other systems. The New York Rangers clearly agreed with that, and the Kraken were able to benefit in getting Capo Caco as part of that trade. So I think that's a good situation to look at as well. Now, I do want to go on one quick aside here, talking about Alexiak, because I think it relates to other guys like an Oliver Bjorkstrand or a Jaden Schwartz. And this is something that I really think the Kraken should consider, and that if I was Ron Francis, I would absolutely be looking to do for these three players who just have 1 year left on their contract beyond this one. I would look to retain salary on these guys and make them even a more valuable of an asset, not just for the trade deadline this year, but also for next season. Like, for instance, Jamie Alexiak, if you're willing to retain 50% on him and make him a $2.3 million player, all of a sudden he becomes the type of asset that maybe you can go and get a top prospect with, or get some really good value coming back. Same thing with Oliver Bjorkstrand, right? If you can make him a $2.9 million player, he's much more valuable at that number. Same thing with Jaden Schwartz, 50% of his deal. And it's only 1 year, and it's only, 2 point whatever million dollars of cap space that you're spending in order to do that. And I think this fits into the big picture for the Kraken, where the Kraken need to be focused this deadline on putting themselves in the best position to go out and be aggressive this offseason, particularly in the trade market. And you need assets to go do that. You need ammunition to go out there and make big trade offers. And so this deadline has to put you in a position to get those assets that you can then go and use to get the types of players that you're going to need if you're going to turn this thing around quickly. And so I think the added value that you're going to get in a return for, say, a Jamie Alexiak, Bjorkstrand, Schwartz, by retaining 50% is greater than what you are losing by having that 2.3 million or whatever it is of dead cap next year on your books by retaining that salary. That's my opinion. Again, I don't know what offers are out there for Ron Francis and how much that can really move the needle, but I really have to believe that for a team like Dallas, Tampa, Edmonton, who are really tight to the cap and are looking not just this year, but next, teams that are looking to be right in the middle of their window and contend this year and next, acquiring a player like that at a big discount cap wise is going to be really valuable, and something they might be willing to move a premium piece to do.
For sure. No, for sure. I'm glad that you brought it up. It feels like something that we haven't seen Ron Francis do a lot of with the Seattle Kraken, is kind of take advantage of those retention slots that are open. I mean, right now, right? No, not using any of them. They're all available.
And you're probably going to use two, one on Tanev, one on Gord, but
yeah.
that does leave an extra one free. Teams have 3 salary retention slots at any given time. That does leave an extra one for a deal like this.
Exactly. And so I'm with you, especially if you can bring in another top prospect, somebody who might be even, yes, it's valuable as a trade asset, but also somebody that might be closer to being able to step into the lineup and start building chemistry with a Maddie or a Shane or any of your other young pieces, and maybe it help accelerate that timeline. But I certainly think that this is something that, we could talk about this trade deadline for sure with these players, but also will probably be something that we talk about again next year and maybe even the year after that, because the Kraken, just based off of where their prospect pool is, we're probably not going to see a lot of guys graduating to the NHL next season, over this upcoming off season. But the following one is where I could really start to see a lot of guys coming up and starting to become NHL players. You and I were talking about things. I kind of talked about it on my last prospect chat. There is a world in which the Kraken have up to 5 ELC contracts, in their starting lineup for the start of that 26-27 season. And that leaves you a ton of room and a ton of flexibility against the salary cap. That is going to be, I think, was it 104 or something that year for that season. So you're already going to have space just because the salary cap's going up, but having that level of flexibility where you could have, minimum they're going to have 3 ELCs on their books for that season, but up to 5 as well. Like, that just gives you so much room. I think this is something that the Kraken can really start to explore, to start taking more advantage of, just because at some point you're going to be able to have those young prospects coming in that just do not cost much. I mean, it's very possible that these ELCs are going to be playing them below league minimum at that point, once like new CBAs and everything get factored into everything. So it's definitely something that I would like to see maybe Ron start, thinking about or using a little bit more, just given the spot the Kraken should find themselves in over the next couple of years.
Yeah, agree completely. Now, I want to look at the other two players with one more year left on their term, and that is Oliver Bjorkstrand and Jaden Schwartz, and a couple forwards that I think could really help a team right now in a Stanley Cup run if the Kraken are willing to move them. Bjorkstrand has a 10-team no trade clause. Schwartz has a 16-team no trade clause. So you would have to work with the players a little bit on a fit there. And of course, there is no time pressure to move them necessarily because they have that extra year left on their deal. But I mean, between these two guys, Dylan, if the Kraken were going to move one of them, which one would you rather see them move?
Uh, Probably it's Bjorkstrand, Schwartz, probably Bjorkstrand.
Okay, and why is that?
I think the way Jaden Schwartz plays as one of the few kind of net front presences that you have on this team, we've seen how valuable that has been now with Matty Beniers and everything. I just think that his style of play has been harder for the Kraken to find, whether it's through trades, free agency, drafting, developing, all of that kind of stuff. It's been harder for them to kind of find when they've gone out there and looked for it. So I would probably keep him around for that reason. Whereas, Oliver Bjorkstrand, obviously I love Oliver Bjorkstrand, love the player, love the skill set and everything like that. But if you're just talking about kind of a floater middle six winger that can kind of go from line to line and provide some skill and add some scoring depth to the group, I feel like that's easier to replace in free agency or via trade later on, or even internally, as guy like Yanni Newman might get himself ready for the NHL here soon, something like that. You're going to be able to replace like that goal production a little bit easier than the skill set that Jaden Schwartz brings to the table.
And I think that's where you see the difference between maybe your coach scout brain and my GM brain, because my answer on this, at least my gut answer on this, is Schwartz all day, because you look at, he is producing at a level that
Yes.
is great. He's the team's leading goal scorer. He's fantastic. And of course, I'm just thinking, this isn't, how sustainable really is
Yeah,
this?
no,
He's
his
32
stock has
years
never
old.
been higher, for sure.
Right. It would be the ultimate sell high opportunity, which
Yes.
as an armchair GM, I am all about that, sell high. Maybe there's a team interested. And also just given the injury
Injury
history as
history,
well.
yeah, I did think about that too. That would be the thing that gives me the biggest pause there.
Yeah. Can you count on him producing like this again next season? And can you count on him even being healthy again next season? There's always that risk involved. And so my GM brain says Jaden Schwartz all day would be one of the two of those to move. But on the other hand, I do understand where you're coming from, because if you are trying to be competitive next season, you're going to need more guys like that who go to the net. He's one of a very few group of players, that the Kraken players, that do that. And it's going to be hard to add, 3-4 of those type of forwards over the offseason. That'd be a massive overhaul. You might need him next year and what he does more than an Oliver Bjorkstrand. And so, it all depends too on the returns and what teams are offering. But I'd still, just on paper, go Jaden Schwartz, even though I do like the player more as a fit for what this team needs.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's a very reasonable take, and certainly like the timing, the injury history, like those are massive factors, and it does make it very close. Like if the injury stuff was maybe off the table with Jaden Schwartz, right, I would definitely be all in on Jaden Schwartz. But I totally understand where you're coming from, and look, as much as I say, it would be easier to replace like an Oliver Bjorkstrand's production or skill set or something like that. he has been a consistent 20 goal scorer on this Kraken team, and the Kraken have not been able to find that easily. They have not been able to acquire those guys that easily, just like the net front presence one. So maybe I'm not valuing that as much as maybe I should.
Yeah, and I think it's just an element of system fit as well, right? They're very different players in what
Very
they
different.
do.
Yeah.
And so I think if you're the front office, you probably have an internal idea of what type of hockey I would hope you would like to play next
Yes.
season and which guy matches that a little bit more. And so you can use that informed perspective that, maybe we don't have the inside details on. So looking at some players that have a little bit more term than just the 1 year that the Kraken could potentially move. And there are some names that have kind of been thrown out there. I'll start with Andre Burakovsky, who has been rumored to be in trade talks. I mean, look, if the Kraken could trade him, I think they should absolutely look to do that. I just don't know what team is signing up for Andre Burakovsky as a player with that contract. He has 2 years left at $5.5 million beyond this season. And even at 50% retained, even if you do get that down to 2.75 million, that number still seems a little bit high for the fourth line production that he's giving you right now. Even if you think he could turn it around and do a little better, as if you're another team acquiring him, why not just wait till the offseason and see if the Kraken buy him out? So as much as, maybe he's out there, I just don't know what team is going to bite.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody's going to do it, and also if you're the Kraken, right? Obviously, it's been two disappointing seasons back to back here for Andre Burakovsky. If you're the Kraken, this last little bit of time with Shane Wright and what they've been able to do has been the best hockey that we've arguably seen from Andre Burakovsky in those last 2 years. So there is maybe a reason to, again, if somebody wants to do it, do it. But I'm not. I'm assuming nobody's going to want to make a trade there. If you're the Kraken, it could also be something in the back of your mind anyway. And maybe this is wishful thinking. He finishes the season strong with Shane Wright, maybe builds back up some of that value, and then if you approach a trade around him once his confidence is back and maybe he looks good in the last 20 games of this season, you can talk about something, making a trade with him at 50% retained or something for a, mid late round pick or something like that. But I think that it just kind of, it doesn't make sense.
Yep. And yeah, you have the rest of the season, see if he can, up that value a little bit and you kind of deal with it in the off season, whether it's buyout, whether it's trade. But I just don't see anything happening at the deadline with him. Next name I want to mention, and he is someone that was talked about today on 32 Thoughts. Elliot Friedman did mention him, Adam Larson, who actually just signed an extension with the Kraken at the start of this season. A pretty lengthy extension, but he does have 1 year left on his existing deal at $4 million before that extension kicks in. And then Friedman today saying that teams, especially particularly the Maple Leafs, have called in on Adam Larson, checking in if the Kraken would be willing to move him. And the Kraken have essentially said, lose our number, that he is not available, that he is not for sale. So I would not expect him to go anywhere at the trade deadline, given that report. But man, if he was willing to go somewhere else, and if there are teams calling, I would love to get out from that extension before it begins personally. It's just, he's 32. You kind of have him signed for another few more years. That's pretty substantial money. That's given the revamp I'd like to see on the blue line. I think it's a deal you kind of would have to look at if he's interested, if another team's interested, but it sounds like that's just not even in the cards.
Yeah, and I understand why the Kraken would maybe not want to move on from him. Obviously, they very much believe in him continuing to be part of their defensive core, but also part of their leadership core for the foreseeable future. That's why they extended him, right? I got to think that that's really what they're thinking about here with this, is that, obviously he still provides good defensive value for them on the ice right now, but as he ages and stuff, my guess is they're probably hoping, we talked back when the extension was signed about, he'll probably slowly kind of work his way down the lineup over the course of that extension. My guess is they're foreseeing a future in which, with incoming prospects, whether it's like a Ty Nelson, a Lucas Dragosivic, or a Caden Price, somebody I'm very high on, he can kind of play that mentor role that he played with Vince Dunn, and he can kind of do that on like the third pairing or something for somebody. Now, I already know where you're going to go with this, which is, that's great and all, but you're paying him to kind of be more than that, right? With the number that they signed him to. But I think that that's really the vision that they've had for him this whole time, is that he can kind of be this older, wiser voice on the blue line and be somebody that can kind of help shepherd in the next crop of Kraken defensemen down the line. I'm with you. You probably shouldn't commit to somebody that far out to be in that role and with that much money, even with the cap going up. But my guess is that's kind of what they're seeing, is they think he helps them win now, and then over the length of that extension, that can kind of be his role.
Yeah, and you know where I stand on the contract, so I'm not going to harp on it. You know what I think, but he is very good in the room and in that leadership role. I can't deny that. I think he's fantastic for the off ice aspect of everything. So you're right. There is that element as well. Also, I mean, the biggest thing with this though is that Adam Larson has a full no trade clause that goes until July of 2027. So until that point, if he doesn't want to go anywhere, he's not going anywhere. And reading between the lines, we see him in the room and stuff. I feel like he's pretty happy in Seattle.
Yeah.
I feel like he's having a good time there with his best friend, Vince Dunn, and just enjoying things here. And that's part of why I think he was willing to resign. So not really worth talking too much about a Larson trade. Sounds like that's very much in the not going to happen category. But the last player I do want to talk about that's got a little bit more term and 2 years left on his deal at $5 million, and that is Jared McCann. And his name has been out there a little bit, but clarified by Elliot Friedman, it's just teams calling on Jared McCann asking, hey, Kraken, is this something you might be willing to do? And sounds like the Kraken are not interested at all at this point at the trade deadline. And I think that makes sense for them. Jared McCann is a player, though, that I talked about in the Armchair GM stream. Maybe you look to move in the offseason if it's part of a deal that gets you a proper star player.
Mm-hmm.
A star, a next level forward. Jared McCann is maybe somebody you could throw into a deal, as a key centerpiece of it that's going to help you get that next level star player. But that type of trade, I really just don't think that's happening at the trade deadline this year.
No, stars tend not to get moved on deadline day. That's generally not where everybody's at.
Unless they're on expiring deals and rentals, but that's not something the Kraken should be looking at.
Exactly. So I'm with you. I think anything around Jared McCann, we talk about players and Jaden Schwartz kind of being at peak value right now. I got to think that, even though this season has been disappointing for Jared McCann, just the age that he's at right now, being 28 years old, having 2 years left on that contract at a very reasonable $5 million given his skill set, especially, oh my gosh, could you imagine if the Kraken were willing to retain on that too? Make him even cheaper.
And I think they should be willing to look into that as well.
Yeah.
A $2.5 million Jared McCann is a very, very valuable asset.
Yeah, you're talking about like incredible level returns that you could potentially get for somebody like that. But again, Kraken obviously have their internal time window as far as being competitive. He would very much be a part of anything that says they want to compete in these next couple years. He has been, your leader as far as scoring the every year that you've existed, right? He is just somebody that I think is too valuable to this group and to this team, given where it's at and what they want this team to be. And I just don't think that you can kind of afford to make that move unless, like you said, it's to bring in another giant fish, in which case that now is just not the time for it.
Yeah, agreed. So we've focused on each of the individual players that could potentially move. I want to zoom out here and look at the big picture of this trade deadline because, as I said earlier, I think the goal of this trade deadline for the Kraken has to be to put themselves in the best position for this summer, this offseason, to go out and get the types of players that they're going to need if they want to turn things around and be competitive right away, which it sounds like from ownership, that's what they want to do. And so that has to be the goal. And so as you're looking to move some of these guys, even ones with term left beyond this year, look to get those assets. And I think you shouldn't be afraid to make some of those trades and move some of those guys. So I have my list of, I think, reasonable expectations for the Kraken this deadline, and I'll get to that. But Dylan, I want to ask you, what are you expecting from Ron Francis and the Kraken at this trade deadline, what would you like to see? And I'll give you the flexibility too. You could say like what you feel like your reasonable expectations are, what you'd ideally like to see, but what are you anticipating here?
I think the one thing that seems for sure, like things would have to really like fall apart last minute, and then there's just no time to submit paperwork for something else, is we're going to see Brandon Tanev moved. I just think that that's the spot that it just makes the most sense for the team. I think it's something that the player wants as well. Probably is the chance to go and be competitive. It seems to just make sense for all parties involved. There should be plenty of interest in him as well. That's the one that in my mind seems the most for sure. Like I said, I would probably lean towards trading Yanni Gourde. I think he provides more value in a role on a different team. I think other teams are in a position to better utilize him than the Kraken are if they were to re-sign him. So in that sense, I would kind of like to see a move there by deadline time on Friday. I just don't know that we're gonna see anything else. Like the sense I'm getting, RJ, really feels like the team wants to be competitive maybe sooner rather than later, and that would mean kind of holding on to anybody that has term and either reevaluating your position regarding them over the off season, because you could still trade them at that point. You'll still have that term, or going into next season and kind of figuring it out, seeing how the season goes, and then maybe making your call from there. Obviously, you're not going to get as good a return on any sort of trade involving them, just because right now you can, if you're a team acquiring these players, you're getting 2 playoff runs out of them instead of only 1, like you would if you were to trade for them over the offseason or at next year's deadline. I just don't know that we're going to see a whole lot from the Kraken beyond Tana for sure, potentially Gourde, just because that makes a lot of sense. I just don't know that we're going to see a lot more. I think there should be, like I said, a Jamie Alexiak. He's just not a fit for the style of hockey that you're kind of your coaching staff is utilizing, and really the direction that you were taking the roster. I just don't think that it fits to have Jamie Alexiak be a part of that, and we're seeing that this year. So I would love to maybe see something there, but I don't know. I think if the team is really kind of committed to this more win now approach, or to be competitive next year, I don't know that we see a whole lot of action on guys with more term.
Yeah, and I don't expect to see a ton of action outside of the normal guys moving, the ones that we anticipate: Gord, Tanev. Uh, Look, I think the Kraken maybe should be, look to be a little bit busier, but you never know how the market's going to turn out. And so, yeah, I don't think we'll see a ton of activity on the guys with term, but here are my expectations. I think they're reasonable expectations. You can tell me if you disagree, by the way. If you think I'm kind of aiming too high here, but I have 3 expectations for the Kraken that I would like to see Ron Francis meet at the deadline this year. And I'll put them in order of, I think, how easy they are to do. The third one maybe is a little more iffy, but I'm going to set my expectations, a little higher, as I like to do. So number 1, do not re-sign Yanni Gourde or Brandon Tanev.
Yeah.
Expectation number 1. So, talked about the reasoning for all of that. Number 2, trade Gourde and Tanev, and I'm looking at, for a combined value, of what you get back in the return, of the equivalent of a second plus a third round pick. It could work. There could be prospects in there, whatever, but roughly a second and third round pick combined value for those 2. And then number 3, trade at least one guy with term. And this is the one I got a little pushback for on the Discord, but I think this is going to be a seller's market. Early signs are that this is going to be a seller's market. Yep. I mean, one of the big reasons for that too is there are so many teams in the East. What, I think like 12, 13 teams in the East that all feel like they're in it because they're all a few points away from wildcard spot. And that means a lot of those teams are probably going to be pretty hesitant to sell. We'll see if that ends up being the case, but that could really benefit a team like the Kraken, who know that they're out of it. If there's a shortage of sellers, prices can go up, especially for players with term, like a Schwartz, Bjorkstrand, Alexiak, and you could potentially see some really good offers for those guys. We'll never know what the offers exactly were unless a trade happens, but I'm sensing opportunity here. And so I would like to see Ron Francis move at least one of those guys we mentioned with some extra term on their deal and get a head start for the offseason and start building those assets that you can use to maybe flip for something else. Plus, I mean, I know you said they wanted to be competitive, which means kind of holding on to some of these guys. And so you don't move all of them. But I think the Kraken, even if their idea is to be competitive, I think part of that means moving on from the veteran core that over the last 2 years has not led you to the playoffs. So I don't think it'd be a big problem to move just one player with term.
Look, I'm with you. It's just as far as moving on from some of those veteran core, I kind of I'll believe it when I see it. Is kind of where I'm at with Ron Francis and this group, and certainly the amount of talk around the Kraken potentially wanting to re-sign Yanni Gourde makes me feel like
it worries me.
Being there is maybe a little bit of a safe place to be. But otherwise, I'm with you. I think I'm with you on the first couple expectations. I think when it comes to moving that player with term, it's definitely on like my trade deadline wish list. It's just I just don't know that I've seen enough from a Ron Francis, even going back to like the great sell off of season 1, that would tell me that I can reasonably put it under my expectations, in my expectations column there.
Yeah, you know what? I understand where you're coming from. I'll say that much, and I know exactly what you mean. But I'm gonna keep my expectations the level
That's
where
good.
I want them.
It's good.
Well,
definitely appreciate it. Definitely appreciate it. Appreciate all the hard work that you put into to prepping all this stuff about the trade deadline, RJ. All the teams that make sense for these players, the reasonable returns, all of that. I think it was fantastic. Very good primer for the trade deadline, and we'll see when we start seeing deals. Real quick, have you checked the front page of Cap Wages, because they do have a fun little trade deadline activity chart, and it maps the previous 3 seasons and shows kind of when activity starts picking up, and it really is that 2 days before the deadline and then through the deadline that we see the most deals made.
that is fun. Yeah, I'd recommend anybody just go on to capwages.com and you can see the little trade deadline activity chart, and you can get a really good idea of when the trades start to happen. So I guess that would point to what, like, Wednesday, Thursday?
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
So,
and I think, for the Kraken specifically too, I wouldn't expect anything before, a home game coming up tomorrow.
Yeah.
You probably wait till you're done with the homestand, and then you can start really fielding those trade calls.
Definitely. So we'll see if when anything starts happening here with the Kraken. Definitely.
And we also know it'll be in like 5 minutes after we finished recording.
Of course,
this, right?
Deep Dive Curse is alive and well, I'm sure. But yeah, definitely excited for this week. It should be a fun one for us here. Should be exciting for Kraken fans. It's going to be a little tough potentially for other Kraken fans, but just losing potentially some of the players that we talked about today. But I just think trade deadline, it's one of the most exciting spots on that calendar, like we talked about. And also exciting is, of course, the law offices of Rico Tessendor. Definitely want to mention our wonderful sponsor of the podcast one more time here before we close things out. While we hope none of you ever need his services, the odds say at some point someone out there will be involved in an accident, whether on the road, at work, or anywhere in between. And when you are, we hope you call Rico at 425-778-9800 or visit his website, ricotessendor.com, to schedule a free consultation. He's helped thousands of people in the greater Seattle area, and as a fellow member of the ECH community, we know he'll help you too. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you all next time.
Hey everyone, before we go, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our awesome patrons over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, especially our Terror of the Deep patrons.
Thank you so much for making all this possible. We really appreciate your support.